At 14:30 hours on September 17, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost stood on the northern end of the road bridge at Arnhem, watching his 2nd Battalion 1st Parachute Brigade establish defensive positions in the buildings overlooking the span. The bridge was intact. German engineers had not demolished it. Frost's 740 paratroopers had seized the northern approach exactly as planned, arriving before the Germans could react. The bridge stretched 600 meters across the lower Rhine, a steel and concrete structure that represented the final obstacle between Allied forces and the industrial heartland of Germany's Ruhr Valley. If British XXX Corps could reach this bridge within 48 hours, if the tanks could cross the Rhine here, 64 miles behind German lines, the war might be over by Christmas. Frost checked his watch. XXX Corps had started their advance from the Belgian border at 14:35 hours 5 minutes ago. They had a single road to travel 64 miles through German-occupied Holland across 5 major bridges that other Allied paratroopers were supposedly securing at this very moment. If everything went according to plan, Frost would hear British tank engines by the morning of September 19th. He would hold this bridge for 4 days and 3 nights. XXX Corps would never arrive. Of the 740 men Frost commanded on September 17th, only 116 would escape death or capture. The bridge at Arnhem would become the most famous military failure of 1944, the moment when Allied momentum stopped, when the dream of ending the war by Christmas died, when Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's boldest gamble collapsed into what historians would call a bridge too far. But on that Sunday afternoon, with autumn sun warming the Dutch countryside and civilians cheering British paratroopers in the streets, none of that was yet evident. The plan looked brilliant, the execution looked flawless, and Frost believed with the confidence of a man who had jumped into North Africa and Sicily and Normandy that he was about to help end World War II. The plan that put Frost on that bridge was born from desperation disguised as confidence. By early September 1944, Allied forces had advanced faster than anyone thought possible. The breakout from Normandy in late July had shattered German lines. Paris was liberated on August 25th. By September, British forces had reached Brussels. American forces had liberated Luxembourg. The German army in the west appeared to be collapsing. Entire divisions were retreating in disorder. Equipment was being abandoned. Prisoners were surrendering by the thousands. Allied intelligence estimated that Germany had lost the equivalent of 50 divisions since D-Day casualties that could not be replaced. The question facing Allied commanders was simple. Could they maintain momentum and end the war in 1944, or would they have to stop, consolidate supply lines, and prepare for a winter campaign that would extend the war into 1945? Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, believed the answer was to concentrate all Allied strength in a single thrust through Holland into Germany's industrial heart. Montgomery was 56 years old in September 1944. He had commanded British forces in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. He had defeated Rommel at El Alamein, planned the Sicily invasion, and commanded all Allied ground forces during the Normandy campaign until September 1, when Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower took personal control of ground operations. Montgomery resented losing that authority. He believed Eisenhower's strategy, the broad front approach that advanced Allied armies on a wide line from Switzerland to the North Sea, was too cautious and would allow Germany time to recover. Montgomery wanted a narrow thrust, all Allied resources concentrated in a single powerful drive that would punch through German defenses, cross the Rhine, and capture the Ruhr industrial region before Germany could establish new defensive lines. On September 10th, Montgomery presented his plan to Eisenhower at Brussels. The proposal was audacious. Use 3 airborne divisions to seize a series of bridges across the rivers and canals of Holland. Drop the American 101st Airborne Division to capture bridges around Eindhoven. Drop the American 82nd Airborne Division to capture bridges at Grave and Nijmegen. Drop the British 1st Airborne Division to capture the bridge at Arnhem over the Lower Rhine. Simultaneously, XXX Corps, the strongest armored formation in 21st Army Group, would attack north from the Belgian border along a single road. The tanks would race 64 miles through German-occupied territory, crossing each bridge the paratroopers had seized until they reached Arnhem. From Arnhem, the entire 21st Army Group would wheel east into Germany, bypassing the Siegfried Line fortifications, capturing the Ruhr, and driving toward Berlin. The plan required everything to work perfectly. The airborne drops had to succeed. The bridges had to be captured intact. XXX Corps had to advance exactly on schedule. German resistance had to remain weak. Weather had to cooperate for resupply drops. Any single failure would break the entire operation. Eisenhower was skeptical. His intelligence staff estimated German strength in Holland at 4 to 6 weak divisions, remnants of units shattered in France. But intelligence also reported that Germany was rushing reinforcements toward the Rhine, that Wehrmacht units were recovering their cohesion faster than expected, that Allied supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. Every gallon of gasoline used in Holland was a gallon that could not be used elsewhere. American General George Patton's Third Army was stalled east of the Moselle River for lack of fuel. American First Army was fighting for the German city of Aachen with inadequate ammunition. If Montgomery's operation failed, it would consume resources that other armies desperately needed. But Montgomery was insistent. He argued that a concentrated thrust offered the only chance to end the war in 1944. He said that dispersing Allied strength across a broad front would give Germany time to establish new defenses, bring up reinforcements, and extend the war into 1945 or beyond. He emphasized that British public opinion demanded aggressive action, that British casualties in Normandy had been severe, that Britain needed a decisive victory to maintain its position in the alliance. Eisenhower made his decision on September 10th. He approved Montgomery's plan. The operation would be called Market Garden. Market was the airborne phase, dropping 35,000 paratroopers and glider troops behind German lines. Garden was the ground phase, XXX Corps advancing to link up with the airborne forces. The operation would launch on September 17th, just 7 days away. 7 days to plan the largest airborne operation in history. 7 days to coordinate 3 divisions dropping across 64 miles of hostile territory. 7 days to organize ground forces, arrange air support, stockpile ammunition, and supplies, brief thousands of soldiers on their objectives. The planning began immediately. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commanding 1st Airborne Corps, was given overall control of the airborne phase. Browning was 47 years old, a career officer who had commanded British airborne forces since 1941. He was meticulous, professional, and cautious by nature. When briefed on the Arnhem objective, Browning asked the critical question. He looked at the map, calculated the distance, and said to Montgomery, "I think we might be going a bridge too far." Montgomery dismissed the concern. The plan would work because it had to work. There was no alternative if the war was to end in 1944. Browning accepted the mission. The detailed planning revealed immediate problems. The 3 airborne divisions could not be dropped simultaneously because there were not enough transport aircraft available. The drops would have to be staggered over 3 days. The 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions would drop on September 17th. Additional lifts would bring more troops and supplies on September 18th and 19th. This meant the initial forces would be at half strength for the critical first 24 hours, unable to hold all their objectives simultaneously if German resistance was stronger than expected. The British 1st Airborne Division faced even worse constraints. Arnhem was 64 miles behind German lines, the maximum range for fighter escorts. Drop zones near the bridge were unsuitable according to RAF planners. The terrain was too marshy, too wooded, too close to German flak positions. The RAF insisted on drop zones 7 to 8 miles west of Arnhem, well away from the objective. This decision would prove catastrophic. Paratroopers would have to march nearly 2 hours after landing before reaching the bridge. Any element of surprise would be lost. German forces would have time to react, to establish defenses, to move reinforcements. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding 1st Airborne Division, protested the decision. He wanted drop zones closer to the bridge, even if it meant accepting higher casualties during the drop. The RAF refused. Their calculations showed that drop zones near Arnhem would result in unacceptable losses to transport aircraft from German anti-aircraft fire. Urquhart was overruled. The drop zones would be 7 to 8 miles west of the objective. His division would have to fight their way to the bridge on foot after landing. Intelligence reports added another concern. On September 15th, 2 days before the operation, aerial reconnaissance photographs showed German tanks near Arnhem. The tanks were identified as possibly belonging to the 9th SS Panzer Division and 10th SS Panzer Division, two elite armored formations that had fought in Normandy and were supposedly refitting in Germany. If those divisions were near Arnhem at full strength, they would annihilate lightly armed paratroopers. Airborne forces carried no heavy weapons, no artillery, no tanks. They were trained for rapid assault operations, not sustained defensive battles against armored units. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence officer for 1st Airborne Corps, brought the reconnaissance photos to General Browning. He argued that the presence of SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem meant the operation should be cancelled or the objectives changed. Browning looked at the photos and dismissed the concern. The tanks, he said, were probably remnants of battered units reduced to a few operational vehicles manned by exhausted crews with no ammunition or fuel. Even if the tanks were operational, XXX Corps would reach Arnhem within 48 hours. The paratroopers only had to hold for 2 days. Intelligence officer Urquhart pressed his case. He was 26 years old, a staff officer with no combat command experience. Browning was a lieutenant general who had commanded airborne forces for 3 years. The argument was over before it started. Browning told Major Urquhart that he was exhausted from overwork and ordered him to take sick leave immediately. Urquhart was removed from planning and spent the next week in a military hospital watching the operation unfold from a distance. The warnings had been given and ignored. The plan moved forward. On the morning of September 17, 1944, the weather across southern England was clear and calm. At airfields scattered across East Anglia and the Midlands, 2,800 aircraft prepared to launch the largest airborne operation in history. The force included 545 transport aircraft and 478 gliders carrying the initial assault wave. An additional 113 fighters would provide escort and close air support. The American 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Maxwell Taylor, would drop near Eindhoven with the mission to capture bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal, the Dommel River, the Zuid-Willems Canal, and the Aa River. The division would also secure a 15-mile stretch of the main road running north from the Belgian border toward Nijmegen. The American 82nd Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General James Gavin, would drop near Grave and Nijmegen with the mission to capture bridges over the Maas River, at Grave the Maas-Waal Canal, and the massive road bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. The Nijmegen Bridge was critical. It was 600 meters long, the longest span on the entire route. The British 1st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Roy Urquhart, would drop west of Arnhem with the mission to capture the road bridge over the lower Rhine and hold it until XXX Corps arrived. A Polish parachute brigade under Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski would drop south of Arnhem on September 19th to reinforce the British position. The air armada took off between 9:45 and 1300 hours. The formations stretched across the sky in a column that took 3 hours to pass any single point. Soldiers in gliders could see the English Channel below, then the Belgium coast, then Dutch farmland. The drops began at 1300 hours. The 101st Airborne landed on schedule near Eindhoven. Initial resistance was light. German forces in the area consisted of scattered infantry units with limited heavy weapons. By nightfall on September 17th, the 101st had captured most of their bridges, though the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal at Sonn had been destroyed by German engineers minutes before American paratroopers arrived. Engineers would have to construct a replacement. The 82nd Airborne dropped near Grave at 1310 hours. The bridge over the Maas River was captured intact in a textbook assault. Paratroopers landed on both sides of the bridge, simultaneously killed or drove off the German guards and cut the demolition wires before the bridge could be blown. By 1400 hours, the Grave Bridge was secure. But the Nijmegen Bridge presented problems. Gavin had been ordered to make the Groesbeek Heights his first priority high ground east of Nijmegen that dominated the surrounding area. Intelligence warned that German forces might attack from the Reichswald forest to seize those heights and cut the corridor. Gavin sent most of his division to secure Groesbeck, leaving only a small force to move toward Nijmegen. That force was delayed by German resistance and did not reach the city until evening. By then, German troops had established defenses on the bridge. The opportunity to capture Nijmegen by coup de main on the first day was lost. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division began landing at 1300 hours on drop zones 7 to 8 miles west of the bridge. The drops were accurate and resistance was light. Within 2 hours, more than 7,000 British paratroopers were on the ground and assembling into their units. Everything had gone according to plan so far. Urquhart's plan called for 3 battalions to advance toward Arnhem on 3 separate routes. The 1st Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel David Dobie, would take the northern route along the Amsterdam Road. The 3rd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Fitch, would take the middle route through the center of Arnhem. The 2nd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, would take the southern route along the Rhine River Road. 1 battalion would reach the bridge, the other 2 would secure the rest of Arnhem and establish a perimeter. Reconnaissance vehicles with mounted machine guns would race ahead to seize the bridge before the infantry arrived. This plan collapsed within hours. The reconnaissance squadron driving lightly armored jeeps ran into German positions on the outskirts of Arnhem. German soldiers opened fire with machine guns and Panzerfausts. Most of the reconnaissance vehicles were destroyed in the first 10 minutes of fighting. The squadron commander was killed. The survivors withdrew. The race to the bridge would have to be made on foot. The 1st and 3rd battalions encountered increasingly heavy resistance as they moved toward Arnhem. German troops, more numerous than intelligence predicted, had established positions throughout the city. Fighting became house-to-house combat that slowed the advance to a crawl. Unknown to British intelligence, 2 SS Panzer divisions were indeed near Arnhem. The 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, and 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg, had been pulled back to Holland after the Normandy campaign to refit and absorb replacements. They were understrength with perhaps $6,000 to 7,000 men each instead of their normal complement of 15,000. Their tank strength was reduced, perhaps 20 to 30 operational tanks per division instead of the usual 100. But these were elite formations commanded by experienced officers, manned by veterans who had fought across Russia and France. They were Waffen-SS, fanatical in combat, ruthless in execution. When British paratroopers began landing west of Arnhem, the commander of the SS Panzer Corps, General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Beitrich, immediately recognized what was happening. The British were trying to seize the bridge. Beitrich had only minutes to react. He ordered the 9th SS Panzer Division to move into Arnhem and stop the British battalions advancing from the west. He ordered the 10th SS Panzer Division to secure the bridge from the south and prevent British forces from crossing. He sent motorcycle reconnaissance troops racing toward the drop zones to harass British assembly areas. Within 2 hours of the first British landings, German forces were moving to counter the attack. This was the decisive advantage the RAF's decision about drop zones had given the Germans. 7 miles of separation between landing zones and objectives meant 7 miles where German forces could establish ambush positions, blocking positions, killing zones. The British advance became a battle for every street, every house, every hedge. Only Frost's 2nd Battalion, advancing along the southern route closest to the river, made rapid progress. Frost's route took him through the least defended area. German attention was focused on the main roads into Arnhem from the west. The river road was lightly held. By 1930 hours, Frost's battalion had reached the northern end of the bridge and seized buildings overlooking the span. German troops held the southern end of the bridge, but Frost controlled the northern approach. Engineers examined the bridge for demolitions. The span was wired, but the Germans had not yet detonated the charges. British engineers cut every wire they could find. If German engineers tried to blow the bridge now, they would have to do it manually, and Frost's men would shoot anyone who tried. At 2,000 hours, Frost reported his position to division headquarters. He had approximately 740 men from his battalion and attached units. He held about a dozen buildings around the northern end of the bridge. German forces held the southern end and were establishing positions in Arnhem. The 1st and 3rd Battalions were still fighting their way through the city, making little progress. Frost asked for reinforcement and resupply. Urquhart replied that help was coming. The other battalions would reach him by morning. Meanwhile, Frost was to hold the bridge at all costs. XXX Corps would arrive within 48 hours. All Frost had to do was hold until then. 64 miles south, XXX Corps had begun their advance at 14:35 hours on September 17th. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks commanded the corps, which included the Guards Armored Division, the 43rd Infantry Division, and the 50th Infantry Division. The advance was led by the Irish Guards Group between 1,000 men and 600 vehicles moving north along a single road. The road was elevated, built on an embankment above the surrounding Dutch polders. The land on both sides was flat, wet, intersected by drainage ditches. Armor could not leave the road. If the advance was stopped, the entire column would be trapped on that embankment, unable to maneuver, exposed to fire from both flanks. German forces held positions along the road. The 9th SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion and elements of the Fallschirmjäger Division German Paratroopers had established a defensive line across the road at Valkenswaard, about 7 miles north of the starting point. They had anti-tank guns dug in infantry and minefields. At 1500 hours, the Irish Guards encountered this defensive line. The lead tanks were hit by anti-tank fire. 9 Sherman tanks were destroyed in the first 30 minutes of fighting. The column stopped. British infantry dismounted and began clearing German positions on both sides of the road. The fighting lasted 3 hours. By 1800 hours, the German position was overrun, but the advance had covered only 7 miles in 3.5 hours. The schedule called for reaching Eindhoven 13 miles away by nightfall. Horrocks decided to stop for the night. Moving armor along a single road in darkness was too risky. German anti-tank teams could infiltrate close to the road under cover of darkness and destroy tanks before guards spotted them. The advance would resume at first light on September 18th. The decision was tactically sound, but strategically catastrophic. Every hour XXX Corps was stopped was another hour German forces had to reinforce their positions ahead. The timetable that called for reaching Arnhem in 48 hours required constant movement. Stopping for the night on September 17th meant the schedule was already broken. At Arnhem, Frost's battalion spent their first night at the bridge under sporadic German fire. German troops probed the British positions but did not launch a serious attack. The buildings Frost held were solid brick and stone, good defensive positions. His men had anti-tank weapons, machine guns, ammunition, and determination. They could hold as long as necessary. The problem was that the rest of 1st Airborne Division was not reaching Frost's position. The 1st and 3rd Battalions were pinned down west of Arnhem, fighting SS troops who had established strong blocking positions. Urquhart had gone forward to assess the situation and been cut off from his headquarters. For 36 critical hours, the division commander was trapped in an attic, hiding from German patrols, unable to command his division. The second lift of British reinforcements arrived on September 18th, but the men and supplies were dropped on the same zones west of Arnhem. They landed directly into the German blocking positions. The 4th Parachute Brigade was scattered and nearly destroyed trying to fight through to the bridge. By nightfall on September 18th, it was clear that no more British troops would reach Frost. He was isolated, surrounded, and running low on ammunition. XXX Corps resumed their advance at dawn on September 18th. They reached Eindhoven by 1200 hours, linking up with the 101st Airborne. The Americans had captured most of their bridges, but the demolished bridge at Son meant engineers had to construct a Bailey Bridge before armor could continue north. The bridge construction took until 615 hours on September 19th. Another 18 hours lost. At Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne was still fighting to capture the massive road bridge over the Waal River. German forces had reinforced the bridge defenses with elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division. Every attempt to assault the bridge from the south was stopped by German fire from the northern end. British tanks from XXX Corps reached Nijmegen on September 19th, but the bridge was still in German hands. Gavin proposed a desperate plan. American paratroopers would cross the Wall River in canvas boats under Fireland on the northern bank and assault the bridge from the side the Germans were not defending. It was suicide, but there was no alternative. At 1500 hours on September 20th, 260 men from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment climbed into 26 canvas boats and paddled across the Wall under German machine gun and mortar fire. Boats were shredded by bullets. Men were hit and fell into the water. But enough men reached the northern bank to establish a foothold. They assaulted the northern end of the bridge from behind the German positions. After 4 hours of vicious fighting, the bridge was captured intact. XXX Corps could now cross the Wall. Arnhem was 11 miles away. But it was too late. At Arnhem, Frost's battalion had been destroyed. For 3 days and nights, 740 British paratroopers had held the northern end of the bridge against the full strength of the 10th SS Panzer Division. The Germans had brought up tanks, assault guns, artillery, and flamethrowers. They had set fire to the buildings Frost's men were defending. The British had fought from burning buildings, from cellars, from rubble. They had held every inch of ground until they ran out of ammunition, ran out of men, ran out of hope. On the morning of September 21st, the last British position at the bridge was overrun. Frost himself was seriously wounded and captured. Of the 740 men who had seized the bridge on September 17th, approximately 200 were dead and 440 were captured. Only a handful escaped. The rest of 1st Airborne Division, trapped in a shrinking perimeter west of Arnhem, continued fighting. But without the bridge, XXX Corps could not cross the Rhine. On the night of September 25th and 26th, the survivors of 1st Airborne Division withdrew across the Rhine in small boats under cover of darkness. Of the 10,000 British and Polish airborne troops who had fought at Arnhem, 485 returned. The rest were dead or captured. Operation Market Garden had failed. The American airborne divisions had successfully captured their bridges. XXX Corps had advanced 60 miles. But Arnhem, the final bridge, the critical bridge, was never taken. The corridor to Germany remained closed. The war would not end in 1944. The casualties were severe. Allied forces suffered approximately 17,000 casualties, including 1,185 killed. British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed and would not fight again during the war. The Dutch civilian population suffered terribly. German forces, enraged by Dutch support for the Allies, cut off food supplies to Western Holland. The resulting famine killed more than 20,000 Dutch civilians during the winter of 1944-45. The strategic consequences were profound. Market Garden consumed resources that might have been used elsewhere. Patton's Third Army remained stalled for lack of supplies. The port of Antwerp, captured by British forces on September 4th, could not be used because German forces still held the Scheldt estuary. Clearing the Scheldt took until November 28th, costing thousands more casualties and delaying the Allied advance by months. Most importantly, Market Garden gave Germany time to recover. The Wehrmacht used September and October 1944 to establish new defensive lines, bring up reinforcements, and prepare for a winter campaign. The Siegfried Line fortifications were manned and strengthened. German industry, despite Allied bombing, continued producing weapons. The failure at Arnhem meant that when Germany launched its final offensive in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, Allied forces were still fighting along the German border rather than driving toward Berlin. The war that might have ended in 1944 extended into 1945, costing hundreds of thousands more lives. After the war, debate over responsibility for the failure consumed Allied commanders. Montgomery blamed the weather, which had prevented resupply drops. He blamed the Americans for not capturing Nijmegen Bridge on the first day. He blamed Browning for poor planning. He never admitted that the plan itself was flawed, that dropping paratroopers 8 miles from their objective was a fatal error, that ignoring intelligence about SS Panzer divisions was inexcusable. Browning blamed Urquhart for losing control of his division, for being cut off from his headquarters at the critical moment. He blamed the RAF for refusing to drop troops closer to Arnhem. He blamed XXX Corps for not advancing fast enough. He never admitted that his own decision to overrule intelligence warnings and remove Major Urquhart from planning contributed to the disaster. Eisenhower blamed no one publicly. Privately, he acknowledged that approving Market Garden had been a mistake. The operation violated every principle of his broad front strategy. It concentrated too much force in one narrow corridor, gave Germany a clear target to counterattack and risk disaster if any single element failed. The soldiers who fought at Arnhem blamed no one. They had done their jobs. They had seized their objectives. They had held against impossible odds. The failure was not theirs. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost survived German captivity and returned to Britain after the war. He never spoke publicly about his criticism of the operation, but in private he was bitter. His battalion had captured the bridge. They had held it for 4 days against an SS Panzer division. XXX Corps was 11 miles away and never came. Major General Roy Urquhart spent the rest of his life defending his decisions at Arnhem. He wrote a memoir, argued with historians, and insisted that his division had been given an impossible mission with inadequate resources. He was right, but it changed nothing. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence officer who had warned about the SS Panzer divisions and been sent on sick leave, left the British Army after the war. He joined the United Nations and served as Under-Secretary General from 1974 to 1986. He watched Market Garden fail from a hospital bed, knowing he had been right, knowing no one had listened. The bridge at Arnhem was rebuilt after the war. It stands today renamed the John Frost Bridge in honor of the battalion commander who held it for 4 days. Dutch civilians place flowers there every September 17th, remembering the British paratroopers who fought and died trying to liberate their country. The broader lesson of Market Garden was not about tactics or logistics. It was about the danger of wishful thinking in war. Montgomery wanted to believe the plan would work because he needed to believe it. He needed a British victory, needed vindication of his strategic vision, needed to prove that concentrated force could win where Eisenhower's broad front approach was too cautious. But war does not care what commanders need. It only cares about what is possible. Dropping lightly armed paratroopers, 64 miles behind enemy lines, 8 miles from their objective, and expecting them to hold against SS Panzer divisions for days until relief arrived was not possible. Every officer who examined the plan honestly knew it was not possible. They approved it anyway because Field Marshal Montgomery wanted it, and because stopping the operation meant admitting the war would not end in 1944. The soldiers paid the price for that decision. They always do. The paratroopers at Arnhem fought with courage that still inspires respect 80 years later. They accomplished their mission, seized their bridge, held their ground. The failure was not theirs. It belonged to commanders who sent them into an operation that could not succeed and then blamed everyone except themselves when it failed. On the afternoon of September 21, 1944, as the last British position at Arnhem Bridge was being overrun, a German officer approached the wounded Lieutenant Colonel Frost in a makeshift aid station. The officer spoke English. He told Frost that his battalion had fought magnificently, that the German troops who fought them had the highest respect for British courage and determination. Frost, weak from blood loss and exhausted from 4 days of continuous combat, looked at the German officer and said nothing. There was nothing to say. His battalion was destroyed. The bridge was lost. The operation had failed. Men had died for nothing. The war would continue. The German officer saluted and left. Frost closed his eyes. Outside, German soldiers were picking through the rubble of buildings where British paratroopers had fought to the last round. The bridge stood intact, controlled now by the same German forces who had controlled it before September 17th. Nothing had changed except the casualty lists. That night in London, Winston Churchill was briefed on the Arnhem situation. He listened in silence as staff officers explained that 1st Airborne Division was destroyed, that the bridge was lost, that Market Garden had failed. Churchill dismissed his staff. He sat alone in his office, staring at the map of Holland. The red pins marking British positions had been pushed back. The blue pins marking German positions surrounded them. Churchill had approved this operation. He had supported Montgomery's arguments. He had wanted to believe that one bold stroke could end the war and save British lives. Now British lives were lost, instead wasted in an operation that should never have been attempted. But Churchill was too experienced to dwell on failure. The war continued. Other battles would be fought. Other operations would be planned. Market Garden was over. The only question now was what lessons would be learned and whether future commanders would remember them. The answer to that question remained uncertain. Military history is filled with failed operations where commanders ignored intelligence, underestimated enemies, overestimated their own capabilities, and sent soldiers into battles that could not be won. Market Garden was not the first and would not be the last, but it was perhaps the most unnecessary. In September 1944, the Allies were winning. Germany was retreating. Time was on the Allied side. There was no need for a desperate gamble. Methodical advances, steady pressure, overwhelming material superiority would inevitably lead to German defeat. Market Garden risked all that for a chance to end the war quickly. It was the plan of a commander who feared that time was running out, that if the war was not won by Christmas 1944, it might not be won at all. Montgomery was wrong. The war was won by May 1945. It took longer than Market Garden promised, but it was certain. The men who died at Arnhem died not because the war required their sacrifice, but because a field marshal made a bad bet. That was the real tragedy of Operation Market Garden. Not that it failed, but that it should never have been attempted. The bridge at Arnhem was not too far. The bridge at Arnhem was unnecessary. And 10,000 Allied casualties were the price of learning that lesson.